In 1945, the Empire of Japan surrendered to the Allied powers. Its colony of Korea was divided up into two parts. The north was occupied by the Soviet Union, while the south was occupied by the United States. Quickly after the Japanese surrender, the 70-year-old Korean independence fighter Dr. Syngman Rhee was flown by the General Douglas MacArthur's plane to the US-occupied Korean zone. When he came back, Rhee assumed many positions, such as President of the Independence Promotion Central Committee, Chairman of the Koreans People's Representative Democratic Legislature, and President of the Headquarters for Unification. He was strongly anti-communist and opposed any unity government deal with the Korean political figures from the Soviet-occupied zone. From December 1946 to April 1947, he spent time in Washington, D.C. to lobby for Korean independence. In November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly recognized Korea's independence. In May 1948, the first National Assembly elections were held, and in July that year it adopted the Constitution of South Korea. In the same month, Rhee was elected as South Korea's first president. He had solid support of the United States, as during his exile, he had developed strong relations with the US political figures. On August 15, 1948, South Korea declared its independence. North Korea quickly followed, and did so on September 9th. Soon after taking office, Rhee enacted laws that severely curbed political dissent. In 1949, his presidential opponent, which he had beaten in the election, Kim Gu, was assassinated by one of Rhee's assassins. He also pursued a strict anti-communist policy. His security police detained and tortured suspected communists and North Korean agents. Also, a huge uprising on the Jeju Island by the Workers' Party of South Korea was suppressed by Rhee's forces, leading to thousands of deaths. Both Rhee and the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung sought to unify the peninsula under their respective rule. To prevent Rhee from starting a war, the United States provided very little military material to the South Korean government so that it could only be used for defense. However, in the north, the Soviets provided the North Koreans with loads of military material, and on June 25th, the North Koreans invaded the south. The North Koreans quickly overwhelmed the South Korean forces, and on June 28th, the South Korean capital of Seoul was occupied. Rhee and his government relocated to the southern city of Busan. The North Koreans were doing very well in the war until September 1950, when the United States, through its full support for the South Koreans, liberated Seoul and all of South Korea and launched an invasion of the North. By October 19th, they took the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang. Around this time, Rhee visited Pyongyang and gave a rousing speech in which he said, "It's great to see you all here in Pyongyang. The war will soon be over." The speech received huge applause from the audience. During his visit, he walked around the streets of Pyongyang and enjoyed his stay in the city. However, the war did not end. The Chinese communist leadership intervened in the war. By December, it had taken Pyongyang, and by January, Seoul was again under communist leadership. After this, the Chinese offensive stalled. Seoul was again liberated, and a stalemate between the two forces was formed. In 1953, an armistice agreement was signed. Rhee was strongly against the armistice negotiations and supported continuing the war. In the 1956 presidential elections, he would run under a slogan of "March North and Unify Korea." After the war, South Korea struggled to rebuild, and North Korea remained the richer of the two Koreas. However, Rhee remained in power. In 1952, it was seen likely that the National Assembly would not re-elect Rhee as president. Therefore, he ordered a mass arrest of opposition figures and then passed an amendment which led to presidential elections being held by a direct popular vote. In those elections, Rhee was re-elected with 74.6% of the vote. In 1956, Rhee, after passing an amendment which allowed him to run for a third presidential term, did just exactly that. He won those elections, receiving 70% of the vote, while his opponent, Cho Bong-am, received 30%. In 1959, Cho Bong-am was accused of espionage and receiving funds from North Korea and was executed. His sentence was posthumously overturned in 2011 by the South Korean Supreme Court. During his last years in power, Rhee was carefully shielded from all information that might upset him. Thus, the aged and secluded president became a captive of the system he had built rather than its master. By 1958, his Liberal Party paid more attention to political survival than to economic development. In 1960, Rhee ran for a fourth presidential term. His opponent, Cho Pyong-yuk, had died just before the elections. Therefore, Rhee ran unopposed and received 100% of the vote. In April of that year, massive demonstrations by students and labour unions began. The people were discontented with Rhee's authoritarianism and corruption. Rhee's official salary was $37.50 per month. However, this was widely disputed, as many wondered how Rhee managed to survive on such a meagre wage. The protest got too large for Rhee's security forces to control, and on April 26, Rhee resigned from the presidency. 2 days later, Rhee was flown out of South Korea by a CIA plane. He, his wife, and his stepson went to live in Honolulu, Hawaii, in exile. He died at the age of 90 in 1965. A week later, his body was returned to Seoul and buried in the Seoul National Cemetery. Rhee, a self-righteous man, convinced of his indispensability to Korea, loathed his critics and opponents, and equated criticism with treason. Although his record as a national hero and his skill in handling United States-Korean relations won him admiration during the immediate years after the Korean War, Rhee became a captive of the people surrounding him. In the late 1950s, his policies were largely without results, as rapid changes in the economy and society deeply affected South Korea's system.